And we are live. Welcome to another episode of Unscripted, and I have the great pleasure to introduce Joshua Copeland. Thanks very much, Joshua, for joining me today. How are you?
I'm very well. How about yourself, sir?
Good. I mentioned that it's super easy with ex-military, just to just get things done. We set it up. You showed up. It's early in the morning. You're ready to go. You probably had a cup of coffee. You're firing all cylinders, and it's pretty early still. So thanks very much for joining me. I know you're super busy, but let's get started by just a general question. What inspired you to get into cyber, and what was kind of your journey into the space?
Yeah, so for me, I was always interested in computers. I was the kid that, would Frankenstein stuff together because, I wasn't of the most, you know, financially means. So I would get pieces and parts from my friends that upgraded stuff and built my own computers. Then I joined the Air Force. I was originally doing logistics, and they said, hey, we need somebody to do some IT stuff. You're kind of the geeky guy in the room, so we picked you. And it just kind of evolved from there, going through a series of different positions. Start with some desktop support type stuff, help desk, you know, servers, routers, switching, moved into some policy stuff, did some pen testing, kind of did the whole gamut before I left the service to the lovely civilian sector, doing all the things that you can think of in federal contracting space for cybersecurity. I ran a cloud platform team, cloud platform security team, before landing with AT&T, where I'm at now, doing SOC and cybersecurity kind of VCISO type work.
And if you don't mind, let's unravel some of that. You kind of glance over the years of service and all the stuff that you learn and how you progress and so on. And it's funny. It sounds like most of us, we kind of fell into it. So we, as you mentioned, you had a passion to tinkering, to taking things apart, to understanding the universe around you, but specifically what was related to computers and IT at the time. What was kind of was that the trigger for people around you to say, okay, Josh, you are, as you mentioned, you're the geeky guy in the room. Let's get going on that. And how you progress from that to, for somebody who's just tinkering, to somebody who has, formal education, and somebody who kind of start grasping the fundamental of cybersecurity and the kind of the mindset, because there's a shift. It doesn't happen overnight, right? So there was probably some sort of progression from you from a tinkerer to somebody who understands the discipline and gain that insight to how these systems work, and maybe apply that to the fact that in the military, the experience you get is intense. Like, there's so much, like,
Yeah.
in such a short time. You kind of glance over it, but I'd love to double click on that if you wish.
Yeah, sure. So like I said, I was the tinkerer guy. I would build computers, tear them apart, put them back together. The first web page I did was done in Notepad. I'm showing my age, along with gray hair and the lack of hair. But yeah, I kind of did that, and they're like, well, you're kind of this, and we have this requirement to do some IT stuff, but we don't have a, actual billet, an actual person to put against that. It's just going to be kind of an additional duty type thing. So I'm like, yeah, sure, send me. That's kind of the military way of, you volunteer for things because that's what you have to do. And they kind of put me through a mini boot camp that was kind of I guess the equivalent of like an A+ type boot camp that was Air Force specific on, how to be at the time they called it a work group manager, you know, again, using some of those really old terms, just that it was very Air Force focused. And then from there, professional schools, going to actual Air Force training, because I eventually cross-trained and became a formal IT person within the Air Force. So went through an actual formal training course, did a lot of what the Air Force calls career development course and on-the-job training, upgrade training to become a journeyman. So where you're able to operate on your own within your designed career field. And that was a whole lot of that. And then, of course, I was always kind of the guy who likes to do school and likes to learn things. So I was constantly out on, Google. Prior to that, Dogpile, for those of us that are, little less hair, you know, uh, just trying to learn things. I have this problem. How do I fix it? And then in the methodology of finding the answer for that, I found the answer for 6 other things I was really working on. Um, then finally decided, I need to get serious about this and start getting some certifications. The Air Force was great for me, and they sent me to A plus, Net plus, and Security plus to kind of get that foundational stuff. Um, Decided, okay, now I need to put some paper behind this and get a sheepskin. Enrolled in college and got my associates and my bachelor's in IT, and kind of built from there. And as I started doing things, I went, okay, I want this skill set. Let me go find training and certification for that skill set. And each role I got, I was the guy who would always say yes to anything. I was in the Air Force for 20 years, and I think in that 20 years, I worked 1 year in the job that I should have actually worked based off of my AFSC. Everything else was kind of going off and doing these special projects that were outside the career field, outside what I should be doing. But it was because I was the person in the room that was willing to say yes, and they thought had the aptitude and attitude to go do these things that are not necessarily squarely in the box of what I'm supposed to do, but still needed to get done.
Joshua, have you watched the movie Yes Man by Jim Carrey, where
I
he
have.
where he wakes up one day and decides to just say yes to everything, and that changes the life course.
Yeah, and I don't say yes to everything, but I am one of those guys that I'm absolutely willing to say yes to many, many things, just because you don't know what the opportunity is going to land you. If you would have told me, you know, 5 years ago before I retired from the military that I would be a cybersecurity director with AT&T, doing all the things I'm doing, I would have looked at you like you were a madman. If you would have gone, you know, 20 years ago, right before I joined the service, and you would have said you'd be an old guy with a beard working for AT&T in Louisiana as a young kid in Pennsylvania, I would have been like, yeah, that's not going to happen. So it's one of the things, by saying yes to things and being open to those new experiences, new challenges, um, kind of really kind of put me on a speed run through my career. I wasn't able to stay stagnant and just do the thing that I liked doing. I was always put into a position where I had to learn new things. I had to become more proficient. I had to find better, faster ways to do things because with budgets, military particularly, the old idiom "do more with less" was always a thing. I served during the sequestrian, where they slashed our budget by a massive amount. So we had to really figure out ways to do what we've always been doing, but do it in a better way with potentially less people. So that kind of spurned a lot of innovation and a lot of folks really digging in and putting in, education as a priority, because you can get really good at doing, desktop support, but that doesn't give you kind of the broader picture. You have to go out and seek that and understand that. And once you start doing that, you just build all these blocks together, and you eventually build this massive skill set of stuff that you can do, and they all kind of interconnect and make you better at what you're doing.
And again, if I listen to you, I hear a couple common threads that made you successful. Is one is the dedication to continuous learning from the inception of your career to now. You're still on pursuit of knowledge and getting certifications and knowledge, like in formal and in informal ways. And then the second thing is you mentioned part of saying yes. It's also, I guess, implies that you get out of your comfort zone, because a lot of times when they ask you to do something, it's something you haven't done before and potentially carries some risk associated because you don't know if you can do it. Is there a particular, maybe in your upbringing or something that that made you comfortable with being uncomfortable and just basically saying, okay, like I can, I don't know if I can do it, but I'll say yes anyway. I'll try my best.
Yeah, I can absolutely attribute it to two of my early bosses when I was in the Air Force, a guy named Senior Master Sergeant Scott Hunter and Staff Sergeant Danelle Augusto. Um, they challenged me to be uncomfortable, to do things that were kind of outside what I normally would do, because they told me it would make me a better airman, make me a better leader, make me a better person in general. And I took it to heart because I really respected these people. They were and still are, some of my best mentors. You know, even if I haven't talked to them in a year, the lessons they taught me were still very much kind of that foundational thing of being uncomfortable is not bad. Um, when I got into SOC, I moved over from doing engineering of tools and doing policy, and I got a call from a friend of mine saying, "Hey, I'm building a SOC. I want you to come work for me." I'm like, I've never worked a SOC. I've never been an analyst. I build the tools, I engineer them, I deploy them, I maintain them. I'll write policy around it, but I haven't done that. And she was absolutely amazing. A wonderful woman named Michelle Boucher was like, "I don't care. I know you can do it. You have all these other skills. Come work with me. We'll build the SOC." And it was a great move for me, even though it was something that I was very upfront about, that it wasn't a skill set I currently had. It wasn't something that I knew I could do, but it was something that, based off of all my other skill sets and knowing me, she was absolutely willing to, throw me in the deep end and say, "All right, you're in the sim, go make it work." And, I was fairly successful in that, eventually moved up to be a SOC director and now a cybersecurity director.
Amazing. And if to pull on the thread a little bit more is you knew people, and people more so people knew you, and so people had confidence in you that you can do it, despite the fact that you may have not had the chance to have kind of the formal experience. And I think a lot of people struggle with that today. That there are, for example, like early graduates or people that just kind of maybe got released from the forces, then trying to get new positions, new jobs. What specifically do you think that made these people feel that you can do it and had the confidence in you?
A lot of it was that I accepted challenges. If it was something that was new and potentially difficult, they put me in positions where I didn't feel bad about shying away from it. And, the times that I did fail, they showed me, this is why you failed. It wasn't, bad that you failed. It was, you didn't succeed. Here's why you didn't succeed. And here's how we're going to adjust that and fix that moving forward. And it kind of made that progression pretty easy. And, I always tell folks networking is your biggest key to, this environment, because if you don't know the answer, somebody else might, Google might, you know, you're in a position where you're potentially looking to do something different. That network is going to be what supports you and gets you those opportunities. Every job I've had since I left the service was gotten because I happened to know somebody who was looking for talent. They weren't looking for, necessarily defined skill set. They wanted somebody that they could plug in and would learn the job and be good at it in, 3-6 months.
And since you had to reinvent yourself so many times by basically jumping into 2 feet into a new role that you don't necessarily have experience with, and it was a lot, OJT, on the job training. What was your kind of modus operandi when you got into that role? Do you remember like the first 60 days, 90 days when you were all of a sudden in a SOC, trying to figure things out? How do you go? How do you start? What's what's your kind of your method to get proficient quickly?
So first thing I do, hit the books. If they have documentation, amazing. Dig in, read all that I can on any of the documentation. Sometimes there isn't a lot of documentation. Maybe that's why they're bringing me in, because they've been working, but they don't have formal processes and procedures defined. Just do some side saddle stuff where you're doing using Air Force terminology, left seat, right seat. You're doing it, I watch, then I do it, you watch me do it. Crawl, walk, run mentality. But then also on my own going, okay, what tool am I using for this? Let me go find every bit of information I can about this tool. Is there a training path or certification path for that tool or that type of job function? Let me go do that, because that's just going to make me better at doing the stuff that they're paying me to do, that they want me to do, and potentially make me someone that is valuable to teach that to other folks, because now I've developed those skill sets. And for me, that's really been kind of the key to spinning up really quickly, is being able to and having the desire to invest in getting the knowledge, whether it's that institutional knowledge that is already inside the organization, or going out and finding new and interesting ways to do that type of work.
And what's interesting as well is no one told you that. No one said, Joshua, go and hit the books. No one said, Joshua, go ahead, just do this extra stuff, figure things out. They just said, hey, I want you to take ownership over this role. But let's just face it, it didn't come with a manual. The manual did not say, Joshua, go hit the books, right? The
Yeah.
manual didn't say, go do this extra stuff. Because, again, if I hear you, I hear a lot of extra stuff you had to do. So if there was the 9 to 5, you had to do all the stuff. But then you made the investment and commitment to go after hours and trying to figure things out and asking the right people and trying to make sure that you get the right, shadowing on the role and all. And it's a lot of proactive, things that you had to take. And again, it's not trivial. I want to make sure, double click on it to make sure that this is some key element to be successful in any, I think in any role, not just in cybersecurity, that you go above and beyond and you have, the ability to ask and be proactive and not just sit there and wait for for the training, wait for, for people to help you out.
Yeah, absolutely. There, to me, a big divide between the folks that do cybersecurity because it's a job that pays well, and the folks that are going to be highly successful in cybersecurity. And the main difference is how much they invest in themselves into the career field. I'm a big proponent of build a better me so I can build a better us. I don't ask folks that work for me to do anything that I'm not willing to do myself. And I try to do kind of the lead by example, where if I'm asking you to do something, go get trained on this or go do that, I'm going to do that, but I'm doing it in addition to all the things that I'm supposed to be doing. So if I'm asking you to go do this thing, I'm probably going to be right there with you doing that thing. I'm just doing it on my own time, because for me, it's one of those things where I don't want to ask you to do stuff that I'm not willing to do myself. That's not the kind of person that I am, because I'm not, I was raised in that very military mentality. My parents were military as well. So it's very much we're all in this together. We all have to lean together. And, it helps me understand what you do better, even if I'm not doing it every day. If I've gone through, the training, the boot camp, or, gone through the material, I understand in a much more granular way what you're doing. And that allows me to help you better, because I kind of understand what you're talking about.
And throughout the career, throughout those times that you jump into these roles, were they any, and you kind of described some of that, it wasn't all, straight line success. There were times where you had to face some challenges and maybe not all of it were successful. Do you remember those times? And we can describe some stories of how you kind of encounter some of these and what was the outcome, and just so people can kind of relate and people do remember stories. Is there anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, I think one that comes to mind for me was I was working on a special project for, at the time, the Air Force, uh, what they called AFNet Ops commander. So 3-star general in charge of all Air Force network operations. And he wanted to be able to access SIPRNet while he was traveling, because his job required him to go all over the place. And I spent about a month and a half at our, at the time it was called AFNIC, the Air Force Network Operations Integration Center up in Scott Air Force Base. And me and a bunch of engineers sat in a room for 2 months, beating our heads against the wall, trying to figure out a way to do this. Because at the time, this is like 2006, there wasn't a whole lot of, off the shelf technologies to do that. There was kind of us mixing, matching building these interesting concepts. And when it started off as like this giant, like full-size suitcase, and through a couple iterations, we present it and they go, no, that's too big, it's too complicated, you're not going to get a 3-star to use that. So then we go back to the table and go, okay, these pieces worked, what can we do to make this better, faster, smaller, more secure, and make it 3-star usable? Someone who's not a comm guy, who's not a super techie person, but is kind of has to get the mission done. And it took us about a month and a half to really get that down. And then we had a option to use another type of device that would have drastically reduced the size of the package, and we just couldn't get it to work. And one of the limitations was that the tool itself required some persistence, and the way we were getting around some of the security concerns was we were using a RAM resident operating system. Well, that counter wouldn't stay persistent because as soon as you powered it off, everything went poof. So that was kind of one of those things where we tried real hard, but there's a technical limitation that we can't make this happen. You're going to still have to use this other one that is the best of the options that we've presented you so far that works, but it's not what you really want, which is this much smaller version. So that was kind of a challenge to, one, we didn't like that we weren't able to make it work, but it was kind of a situation where ultimately it was a technical issue that we couldn't get past.
Do you think that you could have found that out prior to, or you obviously had the can do attitude, let's figure it out, but maybe at the time there was certain limitation, even from a technology perspective, that you could have figured out, like, without wasting 2 months of your time on it?
I would have loved to be able to say yes, but we spent a lot of time working with the actual manufacturer of the device, and they didn't even know that was built into their product. As they knew it was there, they didn't know how critical that was to the actual functionality because they had never tried using it in the way we're using it. We're kind of using the medical term, we were using the product off-label. So they didn't design it to do that. It wasn't, something they even considered looking at. So when we went through this, they're like, yeah, that should work. And it would work one time. And then when you went to go do it the next time, it wouldn't work because that security measure that they had put in didn't match. So it's now in their documentation that that's an unsupported functionality, that it's something that can't be done. But ultimately, they didn't know, we didn't know, because we're trying to do something that was not what it was designed to do.
And they just, they earned 2 months of free R&D by your group, pretty much.
Well, we had them kind of in our hip pocket the whole time, so they were earning their money.
And it's interesting you mentioned that the criteria for the use was that it has to be to be used by a 3-star general. Isn't it the problem today with all the tools and technologies that some of them are just too complex maybe that should be an industry standard to make every tool usable by a 3-star general?
Well, and that's the thing is, you have to know what your audience is. Who's going to be using your product? What is their technical skill? I grew up in the Air Force with the mentality, when you write directions to do something, you should be able to hand it to somebody in elementary school, and you only have to explain the technical words. They should be able to follow the directions step by step with pictures, make it very, very simple. And when you do that, you kind of level the playing field a little bit. And you're right, there's a lot of, particularly in our field, tools that do lots and lots of things, and they're not well organized. And you have to be like a deep, deep SME to really get the most out of that functionality. And you find that the tools that are really being super successful are the ones that work kind of just out of the box. I'll use Microsoft Word. There is a ton of other applications that do word processing, but Microsoft Word just works out of the box.
Yeah,
you go into it.
Work well with others as well. I think that's another criteria.
Yeah, Like it works well with others. It's a kind of standardized format, and you can do things with it. And you can be a super intense power user and do all kinds of crazy things, or you can do really basic. I typed a letter, but all of those things are fairly intuitive, and kind of getting that UX design is really key, especially moving forward as we're getting more and more products and more, processes into, that IT cybersecurity space. We're doing all this integration with supply chain. We're, making it real time inventories down to sales folks at a store level or at a, salesperson level. If the tool isn't easy to use, they're not going to use it. And then you spent a bunch of money on something that's not being used and not providing you return on your investment. So those people who are highly successful are the ones that make their tool easy to use.
And fast forward to today, you're still a problem solver, right? You're solving problems, I'm assuming, for like larger government organizations today, and involved in a lot of multi-variable, multi-stage, multi-tool project that requires some expertise. Talk to me about the kind of like how do you go from the days that you were tinkering with hardware to trying to figure out hardware and software, to trying to figure out remote access to 3-star general, to working with some of these large scale enterprises and government organization. And are there any applicable takeaways from all those years of career that you've had to applying it to what you do today?
Yeah, absolutely. The tinkering is still a thing. Figuring out how things work and how they fit together is an absolutely critical skill when you're looking at the kind of, cybersecurity director CISO level, because you have all these pieces and parts. But when you're at that kind of strategic level, you have to kind of look at the field and go, how do all these things interact with each other? How do I make things, work together and do so in a secure manner? And sometimes that's the challenge, figuring out where you can get the synergies between different products. I had a project I worked on where essentially the organization took all their routing equipment out of the box, took the shrink wrap off, threw it in the rack, and just plugged things in. And while that works, it will do routing and function. It still had the default passwords. It still had all those things. And it was a very diverse network. They didn't buy all their equipment from one vendor. They had about 12. So
Hold on,
there was a
12
lot of
vendors?
12 different vendors. So, you're talking
Wow.
Cisco, Palo Alto, Juniper,
Was that one of each?
Microtech. What's that?
One of each?
Like, it was essentially whatever was on sale that day when they needed a new piece of equipment. So it was a very diverse network. And then kind of building policy around that and figuring out what's the best way to do this. Yes, we eventually want to get to a, one standard vendor across the enterprise. But it's a huge enterprise. We don't have the budget to do that right now. So where are we now? Where do we want to go? And kind of develop milestones of how we're going to get there. So it's okay. We have all these. Where can I eliminate, pieces of hardware that are non-standard? All right, I only have 2 of these MikroTik routers out there. All right, first thing to go is those, and we'll replace those with whatever we're going to go with, or if we have excess of something that we do have that's in a larger number, replace those, and then start building baselines for those pieces and parts, and then kind of do that as an iterative process. So there's still a lot of tinkering because now I have 12 different types of products that now I have to feed into all my security tools that might not natively handle that. So then figuring out how am I going to get this ingested in? Am I going to send it to a third party collector who's going to do some normalization before I send it to my, long-term storage logs because I have, state or federal compliance for record keeping, or before I send it to a SIM for actual, potential investigation purposes. You know, there are pieces and parts that you can look at it and go, this is a complicated problem. And the only way that you're going to get this is by doing some tinkering, because nobody's going to have here is your solution, just plug it in and you're good to go. Everything's going to run.
Yeah, because every environment is different. I'm assuming that every time you come into a project, you realize that it's not the same. I think that's the kind of the double-edged sword. That's why cybersecurity is so interesting, because it's never the same. And then the other piece is that it's hard to standardize. It's hard to figure out a way for you to say, okay, I've seen this before. I've seen the exact same problem. Let's solve it.
Yeah. Well, and you have to look at the way IT as a whole has grown in most organizations. It was kind of a very organic, who's the smart guy in the room right now? I need you to go build this. And they would build something that worked. Not necessarily something that was secure, but something that worked, because the requirement was, I need the capability. CISOs didn't even exist, 25, 30 years ago. It wasn't even something you thought of. So kind of those processes were not built in from ground zero. New organizations that are able to build from the ground up, you can bake security in right from the get and have all that stuff right from the very beginning. When you deal with, particularly government agencies, you're dealing with stuff that is legacy. And by legacy, I mean, sometimes you're going back to COBOL code type legacy, not
Isn't
the
it,
last decade or 2 decades
Joshua?
ago.
That's security by obscurity.
Like, if you remember during the pandemic, New Jersey had a problem with their unemployment because they needed COBOL developers to fix their unemployment process, and they were paying, I think, $200,000 to $300,000 a year to find COBOL developers, because those that know COBOL are much older than me. COBOL was the first thing I learned because I was using a antiquated Air Force system that was still running 1970s code. So it's kind of one of those things where you run into those kind of environments where I can't get rid of this, especially in organizations where you're working with OT, where there is fear of turning it off because it's something critical, whether it's oil and gas or water supply, electric grid. I did a consultant with a city in southern Louisiana. Their entire water treatment system was running on a vanilla Windows 2000 server that had never been patched. It had been rebooted twice ever.
Joshua, I'm trying to stay silent here and not say anything. That's amazing. Well, was it a system that was connected to the outside world, or was it an air gap?
Nope. You could ping it from the outside. It's one of those things where, because it ran their water system and their water treatment, there was a risk aversion to doing anything that would break it. This was back in when it was deployed back in Windows 2000 timeframe. Patches broke. You would patch and pray that you applied it and it would come back up and not blue screen. Well, if you're running, all the water and sewage treatment for a municipality, patch and pray is not something that you really want as a methodology. You want it just to work. And, they weren't super concerned with security. And now, within the last 2 years, what do we see? Threat actors actively going after these OT water systems,
Yeah, OT and
because
SCADA systems.
they're typically unpatched, unmanaged, and have a high degree of aversion to them being down.
It's so interesting. So we covered a few challenges that are tremendous to the industry as a whole. Legacy systems, the purification of diverse environment, it's just because due to the nature of how these organizations grew from an IT perspective. What else is currently super challenging to these organizations, and how they, I guess, as part of your mandate, is to figure out, A, how do I fix it? B, what to prioritize? And I think you touched upon it a bit by saying, okay, let's start fixing the smaller amount of routers, for example, because I know there's only two. Anything else that come to mind from again from your vast experience to how what are the other challenges, and then potentially how do you deal with it from your perspective?
Yeah, a lot of organizations are going to a first mentality, which inherently is not bad. Cloud gives you potentially a lot of return on your investment. It's able to let you reduce some personnel headcount cost, get some higher level expertise because you have folks that are doing this all the time, 24/7, because you're paying for, kind of a leveraged model where you're paying for what you use, not for what you need. Because when we look at, traditional IT cybersecurity buying, I have to buy what I need now plus headroom for growth between now and when that hardware is going to come end of life. So there's some efficiencies, changing something from a capital expense to an operational expense that makes it a bit more, you know, palatable. And then you even consider, things that you only require to run like 4 times a year, where I have this system that requires a massive amount of computing power, but I run it once a quarter. Moving to the cloud is an excellent idea because I can just shut that down for the, 85 days out of the quarter that I don't even use it. And I'm only paying for those 5 days I actually use it. But when you go that, you have to understand that there is also inherent risk to that. You know, are you putting it in the right kind of level of redundancy, high availability? Do you have diverse zones that you have it put in? If you think back within the last 2 years, you had Amazon's AWS in the East went down, and that took out like a third of the internet because of just the way we have our things built and designed around that cloud first mentality or
But
leveraging
Josh,
the
and
cloud.
no one thought that Amazon can go down. That's the problem. That's why
Yeah.
they even inherently designed it for redundancy, because they said, well, it's Amazon. There's no way they're gonna go
And then
down.
it does. And a third of the internet doesn't work. And that's a third of the internet, not necessarily understanding that there are a whole lot of organizations that are running a good chunk of their infrastructure in the cloud that's not the internet, but it's their infrastructure, running an entire system or a segment. You're running your AD for your entire organization in a Amazon cloud, and Amazon goes down. Now no one can log in, no one can do authentication. You've put and crippled your organization because you didn't think through of what are my business critical processes. What do I need to protect? How do I need to create my redundancies and my, continuing operation plans, my coops, my business continuity? Where am I going to kind of build that out? And do I have things in place that put it at a risk level that I'm okay with?
Is that because once you move to the cloud, there's this warm fuzzy feelings that, okay, it's the cloud, it's always there. I have ability to manage remotely, even though there's a shared responsibility model, for Amazon and others, meaning that yes, it's secure, but there's a whole slew of things that's your responsibility. But do you think that the grasp of in terms of what the cloud can or cannot do creates the situation just to you describe, where people rely too heavily on the infrastructure without looking at the actual consequences? And maybe because, again, it's a fairly, even though the cloud has been around for a long time, it's fairly new to organizations. So it's almost like, they were taking the bus, and now they're moving into a car that goes 60 miles an hour, but they don't know that they actually have to put seatbelts on.
Yeah, I think it comes down to people understand the concept of cloud, and they get a really good education on the return on investment portion of it and how it's going to make your cost cheaper, more predictable, and move it from that capex to opex expense. But there's not necessarily not a good understanding of risk associated with that. And that's not just unique to cloud. That's across the board, where as cybersecurity professionals, our biggest job is to understand and quantify risk in a way that the business side of the house, so your CEO, COO, CFOs, understand what that risk is. And then collectively, you talk about what your risk appetite is, what your risk acceptance level is, and, what kind of mitigations or risk transferences that you're going to do. Sometimes you're willing to accept, this application, we run it 4 times a year. We're going to put it in the cloud because it's way cheaper. And if for whatever reason Amazon goes down during that time, you know, we'll accept that risk and just move that processing until Amazon comes up. And that's, a low level risk, high level reward for us as an organization versus, moving to a, mom and pop cloud vendor X who has no real shared security model. You don't know really what's going on in the back end. They're essentially just running, VMware, vSphere, and giving you virtual boxes on that with no, robust security around that. And if you don't understand that and you don't really comprehend what the risks are, you just go, it's the cloud. All the cloud is the cloud. But they're not. You have to really understand, as you mentioned, the shared risk model. What does that really mean? What are they really responsible for? What am I really responsible for? It's the cloud, but I'm responsible for my redundancy. You know, I have to know, do I need this in HA pairs? Do I need this in different availability zones? Because if this goes down, it's a mission critical thing. I need to have it up and running. So understanding what your business processes are, how they tie into your cyber processes, and then what that risk is kind of all feeds into this equation that you spits out and go, what is my level of risk acceptance?
And how do you go about doing that? Essentially explaining the risk to the equivalence of a 3-star general in the civilian life, right? To
Yeah.
executives in the enterprise. So the
Um,
explaining risk associated. Also, I'm assuming, Joshua, that sometimes you have to have the difficult conversations.
yeah. Um, I've always found it best to put it in dollars and cents. Everybody understands money. You know, if I'm going to go ask for a new cybersecurity tool, I have to explain to them why that tool is a good investment, what the return on investment is. And sometimes the return on investment is we're meeting the compliance that we have to operate. If we don't do this, we'll get fined by whatever our governing body is, and we won't have a company. And sometimes that's enough to motivate. Um, Sometimes it's really going in and explaining how this really affects the organization. I can say I want to move us into, a cloud-based, you know, 0365 versus having the exchange and all that stuff internal to the organization. And then I have to sit down there with the math and go, well, here's the head count that we can remove or reallocate to other projects that go into more revenue generating things. Here's the value from it where we're eliminating this, capital expense of maintaining all this hardware. They have to do tech refreshes every 3 to 5 years and break out those numbers that they really understand why that decision matters to them. You know, in IT and cybersecurity, we like metrics and, we like to have, 5.9 availability. 5.9 availability means nothing to somebody on the business side of the house. When you tell them that the difference between a 4.9 and a 5.9 availability is about $100,000 in revenue, then they care.
So there should be part of the CISO manual, the almost like a table where you can quantify the risk associated with the risk to the business, but put it in dollars and cents that allows the business to really get it.
Yeah. And ultimately, money is the language everyone understands. You know, it's, universal. It breaks all language barriers. When you put things in dollars and cents, pounds or yen, people inherently understand what that is. And when I can say, this is what the risk is to this much money, and to mitigate this risk, it costs this much money, you know, that makes it easier to understand than just saying, you know, we could be hacked. That really tells a business person nothing. You know, me getting into the very, very technical, you know, MITRE attack framework, you know, what attack they used for each level of that framework, that doesn't help them either. That's talking way over their head, and they don't really care. You know, what do they care about? The business. What's going to cause us to have the business operate and make profit?
Yeah, and that's typically what the executives care about. I talked to a CISO the other day and said, don't ever come to a board meeting with a 15 slide deck and talk about the technical details. Just give them one slide, the bottom line. What's the issue? What's in layman's term? What's the impact of the business? How much is it going to cost? That's it. Otherwise, you're never going to come back.
Yeah. You know, when you talk to your board, it's what do you want? What decision do you want me to make? Which decision of those options do you want me to make? Why? What's the cost? And what's the impact if I don't? You know, those are kind of those big things that you want to really address to the board because they don't care about the technical piece. They don't care how the sausage is made. They care that they have sausage. So putting in that bubble and that perspective where, you know, I need a new sim platform because the one that we have keeps breaking. You know, this is the risk. You know, the sim has been down over the last quarter 30 hours. We verified in that 30 hours we had 15 actual threats that we weren't able to action on because we didn't have that capability. Those threats led to this. This is what we want to replace it with. This is how much it's going to cost compared to what we have now. We recommend that you approve our proposal to replace the sim with this new sim. That's what they want. They want it very black and white. You know, here's what, here's why. And if something you say, you know, raises the hair on the back of their neck where they go, well, why are you replacing this sim that's, you know, $100,000 with one that's going to cost us $1,000,000 a year? Well, if that doesn't pass the smell test, you're going to have to answer questions or they're going to send you back to get those answers. You know, and that's kind of really where you have to work in that kind of gray area of what risk is and then what's acceptable risk.
Joshua, it's been a phenomenal conversation. But let me ask you one more question, and then we part ways. I'll ask you also like how to best to get in touch with you. As a lifelong learner, you're obviously aware that there's such fast-moving implications of AI, machine learning, new tools, and again, the environment is such fast moving. Like we are always, as cybersecurity professionals, always continuously have to stay on top. That's part of the reason why we have to be on top of our game in terms of continuous learning, because technologies change so fast, and the adversaries are known to be one of the early adopters of some of these technologies and tool sets. What are the current trends that you see? Maybe touch upon maybe some of the AI components, like Chat GPT and some of the other ones we see, and deep fake. I mean, there's so many that you see potentially have a tremendous impact in the next few years. And then what would potentially organization can do to protect themselves?
Yeah, so I think the thing that worries me most is, those threat actors that are doing ransomware leveraging AI. 80% of all cyber attacks involve a human element. Somebody did something wrong that they should not have done. AI is going to make that incredibly hard to tell good from bad. If you do the GP chat, you put in a question. Some of the stuff, it's nearly indistinguishable from a live person writing it. Now imagine that they're leveraging that to do spear phishing emails. That's kind of scary. And then using that AI to build entire fake profiles, build out an entire, LinkedIn profile where, it, for all intents and purposes, including their profile picture, looks like a real person. And then they're able to leverage a botnet to proliferate that same information. So if you would do even things like OSINT, it looks 100% real. Those ransomware attackers and bad actors have already kind of corporatized in a large sense where, they have a help desk you can call and you can negotiate your ransom, and they'll put you on hold and talk to their manager to get approval to reduce your ransom level. Now, because they're, as you said, threat actors are always early adopters. They're going to start leveraging that into all kinds of different things. And I think ransomware is kind of that really soft, squishy part because it goes after, kind of the hardest part of the network to protect, the wetware, the person that has access to push a button. I like to tell folks in general that being an attacker is easy. You only have to find one vulnerability in a network. That's it. Just one. Being a defender is exceptionally hard because not only do you have to find all the vulnerabilities in your network, you have to predict vulnerabilities you don't know about. And you have to put in layers of defense that make it to where if this vulnerability exists, because we know that there's going to be new vulnerability tomorrow, there's going to be new vulnerability day after that, that's why we have Patch Tuesday, because it's going to happen. Putting in those layers of defense to where if I'm vulnerable here, there's enough stuff between, that vulnerability and my, honeypot of gold goodness for my organization that they can't get to it. That's a different level of effort. That's why when you hear, hackers don't need degrees or certifications. It's a totally different skill set. You're not comparing apples and oranges. You're comparing like an apple and steak. They're that vastly different. There's a lot of skill sets that overlap between those folks, but that mentality is not the same. They have to find those one single vulnerabilities to get in. Defenders, you have to look at all of it, which requires a different approach and probably a more, formalized, educated approach, because you can't just go around poking at things and randomly applying security processes, because there are business implications. So when you kind of look at that, AI is going to be huge. Hopefully we're able to, when that matures a little bit, throw that into kind of our threat detection models, whether it be IPS, IDS, your SIMs, throwing in that into some SOAR capabilities. But my real concern is threat actors using that to defeat, the human element by looking like it was from an absolutely real person. Back when ransomware first started, it was go look for the bad grammar, look for the misspellings. That's not going to happen anymore.
Yeah, maybe now it's going to be the inverse. Now we're going to have to look for the perfect. If it's perfect, we know it's wrong.
Yeah.
It's a spelling mistake. It's human. Maybe that's the key. But we are making progress. I'd like to wrap up with positive. You are seeing. Are we getting better? Are we maturing the industry as a whole? Because it is a matter of national security, right? So all the backbones, infrastructure you mentioned, some of the. I mean, we rely heavily on that. There's people that use the services and products behind every day, and if that wasn't the case, we'll have a real problem. But we are making progress, even though it's maybe baby steps, to have a more secure infrastructure here in the US, right?
Oh, absolutely. We have a lot of regulations coming down, whether it's, the California Privacy Act or GDPR, that oddly, because it's a European regulation, but still affects US based companies. There's those bits and pieces. And then CISA is doing an amazing job at just putting out a ton of information, professionalizing kind of what folks have been doing really well and spreading that across the board, making that kind of benchmarking. we're really getting into kind of what I think is maybe a golden era of information sharing across the board, whether it's benchmarks from like CIS or DISA that are kind of giving you kind of the way forward to harden you know organizations that aren't beholden to things like NIST 853, 800 171 are still using that as the basis of their program because they know this is kind of the great starting point. This is where it's tried, it's true, it's well documented, and it's freely available. We're definitely, in a place where everyone understands this is a problem. Between all the big name hacks, all the OT attacks, whether it's the Colonial Pipeline, the water treatment plants, what have you, it's got interest, and folks are putting money into that because they realize that particularly if you're an SMB, one cyber attack could kill you. Like it could end your company. Big organizations, they have kind of the capability to absorb that hit a little bit, recover, and get their reputation back. But when you're one of those small organizations, and I want to say the last number I seen, the average cyber attack costs like $4 million. Well, if you're definitely in that small category of SMB, $4 million is something you don't have. So you shutter your doors, you fold up shop, and call it a day. So people are understanding that, and then we're providing, more tools for those organizations, whether it be MSSPs or CISA has some free tools that they will come out and do assessments. They have a checklist that you can do that can kind of let you gauge in a very self-evaluation model where you are in your cybersecurity program. So we're definitely moving the right direction. The needle is going the right direction, and as a whole, as a community, I think we're all leaning in and kind of providing that capability across the board.
Phenomenal. Joshua, what's the best way for people to reach out to you to know more about what it is that you do? Just advice, just provide some feedback on what we talked about here today.
Yeah. Best place to reach out to me is on LinkedIn. Joshua Copeland, the unpopular opinion guy. If you follow, you'll hear me rant about all kinds of things, including all the things we talked about today.
Amazing. Thank you very much for joining me today, Joshua. It's been a real pleasure. And thanks for all of those who joined today. Stay safe online as well as offline. I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you.